makes me proud to hear it.
Well, the cool thing, guys, is you just went through the entire Move book right now.
Oh, good.
And so we're done. I'm kidding. But every single thing here, all 5 of these questions are very, very specifically put in here. From every single one, from 1 to 5, are very specific for our purpose. And every single one of you are here because you believe this, that conversations can change someone's eternity. And we see that over and over again. And in our groups, and we want to see results happen in our small groups and in our settings and our one-on-ones with people. We want to see life transformation. Part of the reason I'm here today is because someone was willing to sit down with me in high school and have some real conversations and not settle for just answers. You know, it wasn't just, oh, what did Jesus say to do here? He really challenged me to think through and apply some things into my life. And so conversations are powerful. And so for us, as we look into this idea of these 5 types of questions we're going to look at today that are throughout this Move kind of book that we gave all of you, I'm excited to kind of see how they're going to challenge each of us to rethink the way we ask questions and how we work with questions in our groups, and maybe even how we restructure some of our way we do group settings and questions. So without further ado, I want to jump straight in because I'm going to try to cover the whole book in this next little bit here. So, first thing I want you guys to know is this. There's a study done by Edgar Dale. It's incredible what he says. There's 10% of what we read, we remember. 10%. Some of you guys know that. You read a book and it's gone like minutes later. I know Lynn and I are in a discipleship group together, and we got to reread some book stuff like 5, 6, 7 days. We still don't know what he said. It's a whole lot of challenging. Edgar's study showed us that what we remember is 20% of what we hear, and that's interesting. Hearing is something. Even the scriptures tell us faith comes by hearing, and there's some really cool stuff for it. What I love is how when we start to combine senses, we see that growth. In fact, it says 50% of what we read and hear. That's incredible when you see the difference between 10, 20. Not only does it double one of those, it goes so far as to go to 50%. But here's what's amazing is the studies show that over 70% of what we discuss with others, we remember. And so that's why you can remember you've had some conversations with people, and you may not remember necessarily information like I don't know about you, I'm terrible with names. I have to do the whole name games, associations. I'm like Michael Scott. It's terrible with names. But you tell me some of your life story, I'll remember all of it. I remember all of those things, and even when I'm trying to hey, trying to remember this person's name, and I'm telling their life story to someone else, and they're like, oh yeah, that's so and so. I can remember those kind of details, but often I'll miss those trivial things and informational things. What we discuss, what we actually talk about with other people, we remember. And so for you and I, our goal in our group is, as we look at transformation, to see how important conversations are. And so for you and I, looking at these questions, there's a few things. Jesus uses them. And over again, you'll see in his parables, Jesus asks questions constantly. One of my favorites is when he's with the disciples and he's talking to them, and he uses these different types of questions throughout them. Over and over again, when you see parables, he even says a question or two with them. Questions are important, and he uses these types of questions. It's incredible seeing how he does it. So the first type of question is this. It's a launch question. That's what the word we're going to use. Some people may say icebreaker, opening thing, but here's the truth. That question is to cultivate interest in the group by allowing time for everyone to share in the conversation. This is a huge one, and people overlook the launch. We really skip this one because we think it's maybe a sillier question, or it's not important, it doesn't have depth, but the truth, there's some crazy things. A launch question will support your big idea, but also check this out. Your goal with this is trying to get everyone talking in your first 5 minutes. Studies show that after that first 5 minutes, people are 90% less likely to talk after that first 5 minutes of having an encounter with your group. So you'll be able to tell how the rest of your group can go by your first 5 minutes. So looking at a conversation, these groups, these ideas of launch questions, why we're asking a question hey, when was the time you were calm? It's not just to look at a silly question. Or maybe you'll see some later on, it's like, what is your superhero that you loved when you were a child? When you see those, the goal is not just to have a question to fill some time. It really is an opportunity to give everyone a chance to share. To do it in a way in which people are safe to share. Because we're not getting into some of the deeper stuff yet. We're not getting into hard questions, because when we talk about fears people have in groups, guess what? They're like, I don't have information, I don't know about the Bible, maybe I don't want to share my real concerns. And the truth is more likely they are when they start in a safe environment, sharing things that are maybe trivial, not as in depth or as deep to them. They're more likely to build trust and rapport as your group goes on. They start to get to relax. And these are questions that are supposed to be open-ended. They're not supposed to be crazy depth ones. They're not supposed to be intricate and overthinking. Our goal is how do we do these kind of questions in a way which everyone can answer? So you might see some of these, like this one that we said just a few minutes ago. Who was your hero when you were growing up? And how did you try to imitate them? Those are fun things to think about. You can remember the times in which you stole your mom's drapes and jumped off, the couch and broke your arm, whatever the case is. Maybe it's a simple question like, what was your favorite movie and why? Or maybe describing a good teacher that made an impression on you. Those kind of launch questions seem small, but make big differences. And so you're laying a great foundation with launch questions. We're good with launch? Everyone's on here, we're all on the same page? Money. We're going to jump into dig. Dig questions. Dig has a really good shift from that. Like I said, your launch is going to support where you want to go. But the truth is, dig is where you start to help the group dig into God's word and discover what it says. And so that's where, like in your second question y'all did earlier, it said, hey, read this passage. Read this. And so, as we look at it, the dig questions, good dig questions, are going to do this. They're going to cause us to look back at the passage of Scripture. It's going to allow us all to participate. It doesn't have like one answer, like a yes or a no kind of thing. It'll help people also see that central theme that's running out. And this is a big one here, guys. It's not about fact finding. It's not about fact finding. We often misuse dig questions, and we'll look at a passage and we say, like with that example, that Mark 4 one we just looked at. And we'll say, what was it that came onto the boat while they were sitting there? The answer would be a storm, right? We see that in school questions. How did the disciples respond in the fear? That's like, it's all written there in the text. We're not trying to school like in this moment. We're going to start kind of looking to some of the deeper things, saying like, what was it that caused them to be afraid? Because we're going to start actually thinking about maybe what would it look like. Or saying something like, hey, if you were one of the disciples here, how would you have responded? You see, we're starting to look back at that text and starting to kind of pull some things out of it and trying to help your team, your group, sit into the narrative. To really start to process it at a different level than just information reciting. In fact, they showed in studies, this is crazy cool, I love this, like our brains have been rewired from children on today. Google has changed the game. For us growing up, we went back in the old styles of rhetoric and remembrance and, you remember, you recite. Like, that's not how their brains work. We would file them away and we would pull them out in our brains like a filing cabinet. Children today don't have that capacity in the same way. They now know where to get the answer. And they use that information in different ways. Their brains are wired to go, hey, I don't know the answer, but guess what? I know where to go to get it. And so for us, our goal here is to help them process what was it that actually happened in the story so that they can make it and really start thinking critically about what happened here. So for you and I, our goal is not information. We don't want them to walk away remembering every single detail of a narrative or a passage. Our goal is, how do we start to unpack that? How do they look at it in a very different way? Here's some examples. What did the disciples learn about Jesus from this experience? This is specifically looking at like Mark 4. Or the one you guys actually got to answer. How did Jesus, allowing the storm to get so bad, test his disciples' faith? Or this one, what does Jesus' inaction tell us about him? And you can see all of these are interesting because it doesn't directly give us answers from the text. Nowhere in there does it go, hey, here's the reason I didn't respond. It's because of this. But it starts to get us to think critically. It's open-ended. And are there wrong answers? Like working with teenagers, yes, there very much is some wrong answers. Like, but at the same time, not to the extent of where I'm not going to say, like, show me your math. Tell me why you think that. Because it's interesting because what we might think is a weird answer or a wrong answer actually has some great credibility when we start to say, tell me why. And so when we see that, of course there's always like I said, in my circle and in my world with kids and teenagers, I see like there are ones that are just trying to be funny, trying to be silly. Sure, that's fine. But when you start to ask the why, that gets kind of weeded out a little bit. So that's dig. So number 3, your third type of question you start to see was engage. And engage is one of my favorite types of questions because this is where we're moving out of just kind of reading the text, but we're really starting to help them wrestle with the meaning of this passage in today's context. And this is still a broad kind of area. It's kind of general because we don't want to get too in-depth yet because one of the things we notice with people is when you start to get too personal too soon, they close off. They back out. They're like, I'm done. Or they start thinking of the like, how do I answer this without actually giving an answer? You know, you've seen some of those. And so, but here's what some really great engaged questions do. They help us wrestle with the passage in today's context. So like looking at it through modern lenses, modern eyes. It encourages people to think critically about the passage. It allows them to even think about the passage of real life terms. Like we kind of start to really see what does this look like in the context of where they are today. And then encourages people to start sharing maybe some real stories. And so here when you ask these kind of questions, you don't start saying, how do you per se? You start to ask, how do they see this today in other people? How do they see this in culture? How do the people around them maybe respond to these things? Because let me tell you, sometimes they are more likely to share the truth about them when they're starting to talk about other people, right? Oh, I've seen people, they kind of do this when really and truly we project that on into our answers. Sometimes it's a much safer place for people to do that, and you're starting to give them opportunities to share, to talk, and yet at the same time, do it in a safe way. Here's some great examples. Like, what's the difference between healthy and unhealthy doubt? Is it okay to have doubt? See, notice it's not, do you have doubt in your life? What is it you doubt God about? Like, that could be like really scary for some people, especially if they're newer or they're young in their faith. Like that's a hard question. But if you're saying, hey, what is the difference between them? Is it even okay to have doubt? Or you could even say, what does doubt look like in the people in your life? Those are some great ways. Another question you see there is, what are things people hold on to in addition to or instead of God? I love that question. Because how many of us could probably answer that without it being saying it's me? Man, I could tell 20 things about myself, but without it being me, or have you seen God work in someone else's life like in this passage? And notice that's a very specific thing in our stories today, but yet at the same time, it's a safe place for us to answer. So engage still is starting to bring that text into the modern life. How do we do that shift there, but at the same time giving them some safe place, but at the same time still applying it to what's going on today? Because often we don't get to look at the scriptures through today's lens. When we start to do that, man, it starts to become real. This is my absolute favorite one, is become. Become. It helps us to personalize God's words in our hearts. And I love this. The true thing is become will challenge us to examine our hearts when it comes to this. This is where it starts to become personal. But I want to challenge you to also know that this isn't an action that they're going to do. This isn't saying, hey, what are you going to do differently? This is saying, what's going on in you? What is it that challenges? My professor in college used to ask, what's stirred up in you and your emotions and your thoughts? And that's what become questions are starting to do. They're starting to ask us to process, what is it that God might be stirring up in us as we read? And so, it moves us to confession, to maybe even repentance or transformation rather than to guilt. It challenges people to examine their attitudes, behavior, or even their character. And it might even challenge people to rethink their view of God, scripture, or theology. And the truth is if we have these questions laying up that are really safe, that are comfortable in many ways, and we've been sharing, and every one of the groups having those opportunities to do so, guess what? By the time they're here, well, we went through it really quickly earlier in the sprinkling in, but by the time we get here over the span of 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, depending on what your groups look like, imagine how real people could get. When it starts to really challenge you to say, what's going on in you? When you read through that, what fears came up? What is it God's been telling you lately to let go of? And so for you and I, when we look at that, man, it challenges us to start reconsidering maybe how we look at God or how we look at those things. So here's some great questions. It's like, how does this change your view of God? When you look at like Mark 4 is a great example. How does that change your view of God? You're like, man, God doesn't just pluck us out of immediate problems. Sometimes he wants me to learn to be in the midst of it and know he's near. Like that's me processing that in my own. What specific things is God calling me to surrender? Maybe it's comfort. Because I like being comfortable. I don't like having to be distressed. Or like this last one, what is the passage asking you to hold on to? Or what is God asking you to hold on to from this passage? And for me, I'd say like that God is near. I know for me, like I struggle with troubled times when I'm like, God, where are you at? I don't see you. I don't feel you. And so yet I'm just reminded like, Jesus is taking a nap in the boat. He's not even worried about the storm. And while I'm worried about it, he's right here with me in it saying, do you just trust me enough to nap with me? Like it blows my mind at the trust that Jesus had in the Father. So for me, those are great examples of what Become does, because it starts to ask you like, what's going on in your heart? And it's where we can start really getting to some of that transformational piece. The last type of question is do questions. Because we can process, we can see how it challenges us in our hearts, but if we don't also then get to some action, we don't see the results, right? All that processing, even that heart change, that's so important, because without the heart, we can't move forward. But we got to have action too. So it challenges the group not to just be content with internalizing a passage, but also living it out. Do questions will call us to action. I love this second part. They're specific, they're timely, they're tangible. And they create a sense of urgency. For us to understand, it's not like a shotgun thing. It's not going to have a ton of answers or questions or like with it. Because sometimes we'll say, what are 3 things you could do this week? Well, like that's hugely broad, and that sometimes starts getting hard to think of all the things. And that's when we say answers like everyone would say. My students say all the time, they'll be like, oh, spend time with Jesus, read my Bible, pray more. I'm like, you say that every week, dude. Like, so I'd rather ask them, what's one thing? See, there's a specific thing. What is the one thing I'm trying to ask them to do? And I even try to get more specific at times with that. Some great examples of do questions are like this. Is there a specific action our small group could take to live out what we've learned from this passage? Notice it's challenging the group. And maybe you've been studying about accountability, or maybe you've been talking about, like in our context, we were talking about coarse jokes a few weeks ago. What does it look like in your group to challenge that? The next question is this, and I love it, it's 2-part. It says like, when will you do this? With whom will you do this? It's literally asking like, hey, someone's like, you know what I could do? I'm gonna share Jesus with someone today. Cool. When? Like, are you gonna do it actually today? Monday? And then at the same time, saying like, tell me about the person you got in your mind. Who? And you get to go, to the person who's just saying answers. That challenges us. I see that with my students. But this challenges us to be able to also then have some accountability and say, how did it go? To encourage and to uplift and to give us some action. And then even us as our own people. Sometimes, I don't know about you, this is my favorite answer my wife loves. She loves this answer. Hey, when are you going to get to that? I'm like, later. Soon. And literally my wife will walk away and she sees soon and very soon. Like, she's like, Jesus is coming back before you're soon. And I'm like, that's probably true. Like, and so like for me, I'm learning to try to say, you know what? Friday morning, I can get to that. And that's exactly what this kind of thing does, is it challenges to actually say when we're going to do it. Because if we don't, truth is, soon and later are always our answers. So, or like this question, what if we engaged our communities in the way God has? And so obviously some of these, it's a matter of what your context is, what your big point is from your reading your passage. And this is hard. Let me tell you, one of the hardest things is because you can study a passage, you're like, there's so much to give, so many things. And I've always looked at it as the scriptures are really just treasure trove, a diamond mine that you can just bring all of it out. But you know what the best diamond shows do is they'll put their best gem on display. What is the one thing you feel like God's saying, like, here's the one thing we're going to discuss? Because when we talk about one thing rather than many, we often see people remember, act, and do better with one versus all the things we have to remember. So as we look at that, we're gonna do a few things. So the first one is I want to practice with you guys. Don't don't stress. Because there's no, like, I'm not going to grade any of us, like, I'm that way. But I'm going to give us a few examples of what types of questions are these. So here's one. In what relationships, I'm going to move out of the way a little bit here. But in what relationships do you need God to help you grow in those characteristics? What type of question would you say that is? Let's try again. In what relationships do you need God to help you grow in those characteristics? What would you guess that is? Engage. I would say it's a do question. And I know that sounds challenging, but follow with me, because it's actually asking you to go do something. It's asking you, what are the relationships in your life that you need to work on? Maybe it's your mom that you've been fighting with. Right? I'm looking at the student's eyes. In what friendships do you maybe need to change on? Need to be encouraging? Not use some bad language. See, it's kind of pushing them to make a step. I know it seemed a little tricky. It wasn't trying to trick us there, because it's saying relationships. But notice the you. It's asking you to do something. So there's a you that's giving you a hint. So that means it's either become or do, probably. So that's one of those. How about this one? What does it mean to set your heart and mind on things according to this passage? What are some maybe hints on that one that you can think of that are pointing you to one of these answers? What does it mean to set your heart and mind on things above, like according to this passage? Engage. I hear engage. Yeah. Dig. It is. I would say engage. Starting to make us process a little. It's a little hard. It's not always easy there. Let's look at this one. We're gonna try. What characteristics do you look for in a person that's trustworthy? What characteristics do you look for in a person that's trustworthy? I heard launch. You say dig. Launch. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of it. I would also say launch. And so because, but now Jay, I don't think you're far off. I really don't think you're far off. I think I would say in that context, like I would have said, like in B, it kind of gives you maybe a hint to this, but like you would say to this passage, like I'd say like, what did God say makes a person trustworthy? Or do you agree with what God thinks makes a person trustworthy? You know, like kind of see some of that context. Or even a good engaged version of that might even be like, what does culture say makes a person trustworthy? Here's another one. How have you seen others live this out in verses 12 through 14 compared to verses 5 through 11? Dig. There's some really there's some really great context clues, right? Context clues are huge for us. But like it's very clear. It's like comparing two passages, and it's making us guess what? It's saying, hey, how do we get back into looking at that? Got to go back. Got to see it with our own eyes a little bit. So that's a great. I love that most of us are on it. And then that leaves us with this one. How have you grown in the characteristics listed in verses 12 through 14 in the past year. Become. That's correct. You can see some of that. That's a great way to look at it. But also you can see it's challenging us. It's saying, where have you grown in that area? Where have you grown? And so you start to see kind of some of those things. Dude challenges us to action in a very specific way. Engage challenges us to look at culture today, realities of today, even other people around us. Launch is that interesting hook that we're going to try to get everyone sharing in the first few minutes. Nothing hard or complicated. Dig it's going to make us look back at the scriptures. And it's going to do it in a way to make us really think critically about it. It's going to make us think out of the box versus just test answers. And then become. Who is God challenging you to become in your life? What is He asking your heart to become? Because while God does care about our actions, I think He also cares about our hearts. So those are those type of questions. We're a little low on time for my last activity, but I want to try this first one. I was going to break us into groups, but I'm just going to do this. If you're going to rewrite some of these questions, we're going to go to number 2 for a dig one. Rewrite this question to a dig question. Says, this is the bad version of that in my opinion. We might say, why would we want all the godly virtues listed in this passage in our life compared to sinful ones? So let's try, how would you maybe rewrite that into a different dig question? Looking back at the scriptures, what's a way you would redo that one?
If you had to choose one of these godly virtues, which would you choose?
That's a great one. That is a good one. What's another way you might say it?
So the reverse would be, do you see any of these sinful characteristics in your life right now?
There, you could definitely ask that. You're brave to do it early for the sake of, if you're in a strong group, I think it works well. If you're in a newer group, that can be hard.
Yeah, that's true.
It just depends on where you and your group are at. And that's something only you can know. If you're with your group that you trust each other, you could dive in a little harder, a little deeper. If you're the newer group, I'd probably say the positive of it. Maybe saying, what godly virtues do you think are really interesting? Which ones speak out to you? Or maybe which ones are you seeing in other people? So there's some of those. Let's try one more. We're going to do number 4, because become, I think, is such a great one. But it says, which sinful characteristics do you struggle with the most? That's such like, oh man. And I get why someone would write this, if it's listing out sins and live by the Spirit, or those kind of things. But how would you write that differently in a become way? Thinking of the heart, who is it God wants you to become? Not actions yet, but who He wants you to become.
Is there a sinful characteristic you'd like to overcome?
That's a great way to reword that. And it's also very specific. It's looking at one, right? It's also maybe not putting it in a way of like struggle. Like it just has a different light on it. Just even saying you're overcoming versus just you struggle with. What's another way we might word that question?
Maybe are one of these sinful characteristics an area you received victory and how did that
That's a
happen?
That's a great question. I love that. Yeah, that's a good one. So you could look at it in that way. Definitely, those are some really good, tangible ways. I might even go as far as to say, what sinful thing would you like to, which godly characteristic would you like to replace a sinful one in your life? Because what it does there is that opens up the door to say, hey, look, there is some struggle. We're all honest about that. But man, if I could work through this, I want God to really replace it with this. So just starting to challenge maybe that.
Would you talk to it in terms of more not specific person, but more of a group, as that kind of approach it more like that, and
You with a heavy topic, you totally could.
high school kids have trouble with this,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and I think definitely looking at your audience. So, like, if I would have had high school boys at my house and talking about this is definitely not my starting thing. It's a become question. But I wouldn't have a struggle going in with this one with, like, high school boys. Because we talk pretty openly, we're pretty honest, they trust each other really well. Junior high boys? Definitely wouldn't. I would probably word it very, very differently. I would even probably go as far as to say, how do you feel, or I might even say, how do you think God responds when you struggle with that sin in your life? Not even asking what the sin is, but asking how do you think God feels about your sin? And so that's also a little bit safer because of the audience they're talking to. So you gotta just look at knowing who you're talking with, where that trust is, but also saying, making them to wrestle with it a little bit is a good thing. So I really highly recommend this. This is one of the best resources I've been given. Zach gave this to me when I came on, and it's revolutionized the way I do small groups. In fact, I try to even do the less questions, the better, because with my students, the more questions they can zone out a whole lot easier. But when we get into real questions, we're talking about real stuff. And notice most of these questions are not like right and wrong. It's if they're being honest, and they're saying, I struggle with this and I want to overcome this, none of us are gonna go, that's wrong. It also might be but if they're being silly, yeah, there's some of that. But seeing how God uses it, it's incredible. Seeing how transformation starts to happen. So feel free to do it. The best part is there's even some practice things at the end of every single one of these as you're going through them, as you're reviewing them. It says, hey, rewrite this. Here are examples of good. Here's some examples of bad ones. And so it does a great job of just helping you work through it. If you ever have more questions, love to talk through it. I come back to this all the time. It's my favorite resource. So thank you guys.
thank you.
Enjoy.